Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take your sources, articles, videos, notes, whatever you've got, and we really pull out the core insights, those surprising facts that help you get truly informed, fast. Our goal, cut through the noise, get to the heart of it. And today we're diving deep into something, well, pretty fascinating and maybe a bit challenging. This idea of the declining authority of ancestry. We've got a great mix of material for this one. Some academic stuff on race and gender, really personal stories about identity, and some solid historical analysis, too. It's all aimed at exploring how these traditional ideas of who we are, well, they're being questioned, maybe even redefined.
Absolutely. And what we're really going to explore is how these deep-seated assumptions we have about identity, especially racial identity, are being actively, pushed back against and reshaped right now. This deep dive, I think it's going to bring up some really thought-provoking stuff about what actually shapes us. And importantly, how that understanding might be shifting away from, let's say, what we used to think was fixed. It's more than just theory. It really touches how people experience their own identity.
Okay, right. Let's unpack this then, because going through the sources, one thing just jumps right out, and it's definitely a charged one. Transracial identity. So for anyone not familiar, our sources are defining transracial here as a label for people who feel they identify as a different race than the one they were, born into. And this often means changing appearance, getting involved in the culture. What was your take when you saw this popping up?
Well, yeah, what's immediately fascinating, I think, is how this new way of using transracial just flies in the face of such a basic societal assumption about identity. I mean, historically, transracial meant something quite different, didn't it? Usually interracial adoption, like, a black child adopted by a white family. That was the common understanding. But this new usage, self-identified race, it gets a totally different reaction, often like suspicion, right? Which is so different from how the older term was used. It really makes you ask, why the huge difference? Why treat these two things so differently?
It really is such a contrast, isn't it? And the personal stories in our sources, they really bring it home. Like Martina Big. She's a German model who physically went from presenting as white to presenting as black. And her view, this is a quote from one source, she says, every color has a place to be. It's not only outside the color, it's also the inside, because we are all the same, but it's not the color that is important, it's the brain, the fantasies. Okay. She's had significant physical changes, skin, hair, eyes, and she genuinely feels her roots are getting bigger and bigger. That's quite something, isn't it? About self-perception versus, origin. And then there's this other story from Reddit, user Gezitopan. Born white, American, but feels deeply connected to Japanese culture. Talks about dyeing hair black, using makeup for a Japanese or Asian look. And they ask this really quite moving question. Why can't we be the race we choose? Saying their chosen look feels like their true self.
Yeah, these stories really shine a light on what one source calls that societal knee-jerk position. This instant suspicion, the pushback against people trying to change race. And it's such a contrast, especially now, with the sort of growing acceptance, or at least discussion, around transgender identity. It really forces you to think, okay, why is one kind of identity shift seen as, well, maybe legitimate or at least understandable by more people, while the other gets such strong resistance? What's underlying that? What assumptions are at play about identity itself?
So if people are starting to self-identify across racial lines, what does it actually do to our whole understanding of race? This is where, for me anyway, it got really, really interesting. The sources show pretty clearly that race itself is much less fixed, much less about biology than maybe most of us grew up assuming. It really digs into how we categorize people.
Indeed. And if you look at the history, the sources explain that the whole European idea of race, as we tend to think of it, it really emerged during a specific time, the scientific revolution, European imperialism, colonization. It wasn't just about describing groups. It was, frankly, used to classify people and, to justify things like the subordination of African slaves. It set up this binary, this civilized versus uncivilized idea. And that directly fed into things like social Darwinism, like a whole survival of the fittest, applied wrongly to human societies, often to prop up racial hierarchies. So its origins are tangled up with power and control, not just neutral observation.
Right, and the science itself. Well, scientists have been wrestling with this for ages, which the sources really highlight. There was this survey back in 1985, showed a decent chunk of biologists, 16%, and even more developmental psychologists, 36%, actually disagreed that there are distinct biological races in Homo sapiens. That kind of surprised me, honestly. It goes against what you might think is common knowledge. And textbooks changed too. Physical anthropology books apparently shifted in the 70s, moving away from saying biological races exist. Biology textbooks often just dropped the topic to avoid the politics, which says a lot, right? The takeaway from one study was pretty blunt. Race is socially dysfunctional and biologically indefensible. It hides how genetically similar we all are and how variation is more like a mosaic, not fitting neat racial boxes. It really pulls the rug out from under fixed biological race.
Yeah, although it's important to be precise here. While the social construct of race is being challenged, the sources do acknowledge that certain biological traits do show variation linked to ancestry, like hair texture. You mentioned hair cross-section earlier, flat for African ancestry, oval for European Middle Eastern, round for Asian Native American. Those variations exist. But, and this is the key point the sources make, the social idea of race goes way, way beyond these specific biological markers. Genetics consistently shows the sort of universal genetic mixedness, continuous variation, not sharp racial divides, but society. We still mostly operate with these rigid categories in our heads.
Oh, absolutely. And you see that rigid categorization, but also its weird flexibility in official things, too. Like the U.S. Census, that was fascinating. Between, what was it, 1850 and 1920, they actually had official categories like mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, terms we barely hear now. But then, boom, 1930, they vanished.
Yeah.
Consolidated under the one-drop rule, basically saying any known black ancestry made you black. That just shows so clearly how politics and social ideas shape these labels,
Yeah.
right? It's not some fixed biological truth handed down. It changes based on social currents.
Exactly. And the impact of that is huge in people's lives. It's crucial to remember, like the sources stress, the Black experience is not monolithic. It's not one single thing. Some Black individuals face racism constantly, painfully. Others might experience it less or differently depending on their life, their environment, upbringing. It busts those single narratives and shows how much individual perspective matters, even within these broad social categories.
Okay, so let's switch gears slightly and explore this powerful comparison the sources make. This is where I think the idea of ancestry's authority really starts to look shaky. The parallel between race and gender identity.
This is really compelling. How the public is starting to grasp, or at least discuss, gender fluidity. You know, the idea that gender isn't just your birth sex. The conversation gives us a lens maybe to look at racial fluidity too. One source puts it very directly, saying there's basically no coherent principled defense for saying transgender identity is okay, but transracial identity isn't. It sort of forces a consistency check on how we view identity shifts. If one is possible, why not the other, logically?
That really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? So what do the sources say about why we react so differently? Is it history, psychology? What's the root cause the material suggests? And how does that connect back to the argument about accepting trans people without needing to fully solve the biology versus social construct debate for gender? If we can accept changing sex categories, regardless of chromosomes, then why should biology, why should ancestry be this absolute barrier for racial identity? It challenges the very basis of how we validate identity.
Well, the sources suggest a lot of the discomfort with transracial identity comes from those deep historical roots we talked about, race being seen as this fixed biological thing tied up with power, slavery, historical wrongs. Gender, while obviously having its own complex history and biases, has perhaps seen more rapid shifts in public understanding recently. And about the privilege argument that always comes up, the sources tackle that head on. They say, okay, maybe a male to female trans person could theoretically return to male privilege, or a female to male transition might seem easier in some ways because of societal biases. That doesn't make the transition itself invalid. Exercising privilege, the sources argue, that's a separate issue. It's not inherent in the transition. So the goal shouldn't be stopping transition, but maybe ensuring equal access to the resources that permit one to change race. And we do see appearance changes like Michael Jackson vitiligo, maybe bleaching, or Lil' Kim going from black presentation towards white. These cases get pulled into this discussion about identity fluidity, whether chosen or, medically influenced.
That's a really interesting way to frame the privilege point. And building on that, the sources bring in these academic ideas, originally about gender, that really shed light on racial identity, too. They talk about trans of migration, like moving from one category to another, maybe changing appearance, then trans of between, defining yourself kind of in relation to categories, but not fully in one, and trans of beyond, just ditching categories altogether, applying those frameworks, usually for gender, to race. It's kind of mind-bending, actually. It really opens things up.
It really does. And this leads us to that powerful quote, which feels central to this whole idea of ancestry losing its grip. How I feel is more powerful than how I was born.
Yeah.
That just puts the question right out there, doesn't it? If identity becomes more about this internal feeling, this existential choice, what happens to the old authority of ancestry? The idea that your bloodline dictates everything. It suggests a huge potential shift in how we even define ourselves.
Yeah, this whole exploration, this deep dive, it points to this bigger trend, doesn't it? what some sources call the unsettling of identities. So what does that actually mean for us, for Ancestry's role going forward?
It means we're living through this real tension, a sort of conflict between choice, autonomy, making yourself, versus what's given, biology, nature, essence. Society is basically trying to figure out how to balance these two things. How much is choice? How much is fixed? It's a big negotiation happening right now.
And out of that tension comes this anti-categorical stance, right? People just refusing to tick a box, racially or ethnically, either personally or even politically. And it's interesting, like you see in the U.S. Census sometimes, skipping the race question is often more acceptable, maybe less flagged than skipping the sex-gender question. That kind of hints at a bit of skepticism already creeping in about how legitimate these racial categories are, at least in some official ways. Maybe Ancestry's authority is already eroding subtly there.
Exactly. And ultimately, by looking at race through the lens of gender, using this trans concept as a sort of analytical tool, the sources argue we can see really clearly the deep contingency and arbitrariness of racial categories, how constructed they are. Now, this idea isn't brand new in universities, but it's mostly been, trapped in the academy, as one source put it. It hasn't really broken through into wider public conversations that much. But now, maybe with these personal stories and the gender parallels, it's starting to filter out, prompting people to think about the artificiality, constructedness, and instability of race. And yeah, that definitely signals a potential declining authority of ancestry, a move away from it being the absolute only factor defining identity, towards something more fluid, more self-defined.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. We've seen how race is arguably more social construct than biology, how the science shows more nuance in mixing the neat boxes, and how personal stories, plus the whole conversation around gender fluidity, are really challenging ancestry as the be-all and end-all of who we are. It's definitely a shift. Can be uncomfortable to think about, too.
It really can. And it leaves us with this big, provocative question to chew on, right? If identity is shifting more towards how we feel and choose to be rather than just what we're born as, what does that mean for everything built on those old ancestral lines? Shared history, community, social structures. How do they adapt? What will the authority of ancestry even look like a generation or two from now? And how might that reshape our world? Definitely something to keep talking about.
Absolutely. A lot to mull over there. Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive. Thanks so much for joining us. Keep thinking, keep exploring, and definitely keep questioning. We'll catch you next time.